Good afternoon. Today we'll be discussing an important poem that we have in our syllabus, which is Kamala Das's An Introduction. Kamala Das's An Introduction was included in her collection of poems published in 1965 titled Summer in Calcutta, and in this particular poem we have Kamala Das in a confessional mode revealing how she grew up in a society that was conditioned by patriarchy, where girls and women did not have the freedom to indulge in the basic necessities of life in terms of choice and living. And the poem is a very elaborate account of the different aspects of life in Kamala Das's years of growing up, where she felt she was threatened and throttled by conditions of patriarchy. Now, this poem essentially is a poem that focuses on love and the pain that follows betrayal. In fact, this is a poem which is one of her most popular works, and it is confessional in nature, in which Das is professing her own deep emotions in regard to the patriarchy which controlled her life, as I told you. The poem does not contain a specific rhyme or rhythm. The lines, as you may have known by now after going through the text once, also vary greatly in length and syllable number. There are moments in the poem in which Das uses techniques such as enjambment, repetition, and anaphora. Repetition and anaphora are seen at the beginning of a number of lines, such as line number 4 and 5, in which case the speaker is giving two conviction filled statements about who she is. With regard to what is there in the poem, let me begin by giving you a very brief preview of what is there in the first stanza, if we may call it, of this particular work. The poem essentially begins by comparing Kamala Das's knowledge of politicians to the days of the week and months of the year. Although she does not have a firm grasp on politics itself, but she knows the names of people who have been in power. This shows their power to be much greater than their rule should allow. And after these opening lines, we see that the speaker moves on to describe her own being. She says she is Indian and very brown. And lastly, she is from Malabar in southwest India. These are the basics of her life, but of course, it's not everything. Then she goes on to describe language and the role it plays in her life by saying that she is judged for writing in English. English is not her mother tongue. Whenever she is criticized for how she speaks and writes, she naturally feels that she is alone. There is no one, not her friends or cousins, who support her, and they are all her critics, which she asserts with the very poignant and powerful words, everyone. As the poem progresses, we see that the speaker goes on to describe herself as half English, half Indian. Half English because she was beginning to write freely in English, which incidentally was not her mother tongue, as she told earlier. And she sees even a humor in this combination and acknowledges the fact that it is an honest combination. This seems to be one of the most important parts of her. In fact, Kamala Das's poems, including the poems in her collection Summer in Calcutta, are very lucid but at the same time powerful accounts of a desire to be both authentic and honest with regard to her expressions, personal expressions. In this case as well, her identity, as is seen through her voice, is very human. and she in fact defines repeatedly that the very fact that she is human should be enough for others to allow her the basic freedom that a human being needs in order to live and develop in society. As the poem progresses still, we feel that she is gradually intensifying the extent of her pain by telling that human speech is as natural to a human being as uh, a sound that is caused by a storm or a raging fire to either storm or the fire. In fact, it is as natural as existence itself. To that extent, she says that as she grows older, she feels that though she was repeatedly reminded of her own physical changes, she was also at the same time repeatedly reminded that English was not her mother tongue, and therefore she would rather do well by expressing herself in a language which is closer to her, as the society says. The result of which is that she is essentially unhappy, and this unhappiness is so deep that we get to know by the middle of the poem that this need for freedom, uh, freedom to do whatever she liked, freedom to do whatever is needed to express herself with authenticity and honesty, are all freedoms which she was lacking. And on the other side, there was another pain that was growing up in her mind, and that pain was the fact that she was not in a position to feel freely with regard to her emotions of love. In fact, she asked for love, as she says in the poem, uh, because she did not know what she was essentially wanting, and this ultimately ended in her getting married at the age of 16. And it was a marriage which nevertheless was not a marriage that was desired by her as an avenue to get the love that she wanted, but was rather socially conditioned in a patriarchal setup whereby a girl approaching the age of 16 would rather get married. As the poem progresses still, we get to know that uh, Kamala Das was repeatedly placing her own body as a symbol of everything that was about to be put forth by a creative mind in terms of resistance to the entire social setup that was conspiring, as it were, to get her uh, freedom. And to that extent, she goes on to say that though changes came to her, this changes was partly conditioned by her own nature as she grew, and partly conditioned by her liking, for example, her brother's trousers, or the cutting off of her hair to resemble a male. And essentially, we get to know that the speaker is wanting to rid herself of the conceptual, conceptually traditional female image that she has to wear a female dress or has to have her hair long. And now that she is making her own identity as she grew into womanhood, we get to know that she was also fighting against categorizers in the society, people who were adept at categorizing people into a male or a female, into a good male or a good female, into an obedient male or an obedient female. And the categorizers always wanted her to fall in place in the conception, in the conventional notion of what would constitute an ideal woman. And in the last drift of the poem, we get to know that she met and was loved by a man, but nevertheless, it was a love that could not last long enough to give her any sense of uh, freedom of choice. And ultimately, the poem ends with a resolution that in spite of the fact that she is aching, the I-ness of her still asserts its I-ness, and uh, in fact her aches, which are her aches alone and not the aches of which can be shared by others, as she lay alone in hotels of strange towns. So essentially the poem ends with a notion of loneliness. It's not a poem that ends with anybody emerging victorious. It's a poem which asserts that in a society which pits conventional notions of patriarchy on a woman who loves freedom to do whatever she likes, or thinks whatever she likes, or writes whatever she likes, in whatever language she likes, in this conflict, none emerges as winners. And to that extent, readers of the poem An Introduction would be beset by a deep sense of waste that goes into the work. And in this particular case, since it's an autobiographical poem, we cannot but help reconstruct in a sense the growing up of Kamala Das uh, from a girl into a woman and into womanhood. The growing up was clearly not something which was natural in the sense of a freedom loving girl wishing to grow up into womanhood. It was deeply painful. Even there are strains of disillusionment in the poem, as you will detect if you read them in some depth. And that is how the poem essentially ends. So this is what I had to tell you today with regard to introducing you to Kamala Das's An Introduction. We shall go into the text, analyze lines, explore nuances in our next class. Thank you.